All right. Remember to keep your masks on. Okay, we're watching the news on COVID-19, and so I'm in that age group, you know. So, all right. Last time we were talking about that socialism is a system of a complete monopoly, right? And that if the of course I can't speak very well with that on, and that we said that what are we trying to do? We're trying to minimize the total amount of coercion, and what we want to do is we want to have each person have the ability to act according to their own plan, right? Because information is so decentralized. And last time we noted that property rights is a key to establishing this sphere of free action. That's what Hayek talks about here. So property rights are there to what? To establish a sphere of free action where you can act according to your own plan. Then what he starts to do, he begins to look at what are some of the characteristics of the law that would make it difficult for the government to coerce you, right? So if we're going to have a law, we've already talked about it a bit, where he talks about, you know, laws should be general. That is, we shouldn't know beforehand to whom they're going to apply. But let's look at what are these characteristics of the law that will make it difficult for government to coerce you. Now again, it's not that we don't want to have government at all, right? We said that, you know, over and over again that classical liberals are not anarchists. You need to have government to make it so that we have a limited amount of coercion. You're trying to steal my stuff. I don't want you to steal my stuff. What do I want to do? Somebody's not going to get the ability to act according to their own plan. So the government's got to be in there doing that. So the first thing he says, that, and we've already discussed that, is that it ought to be general. And again, if you look at the old exams, I'll almost always ask you the question where I want you to tell me what are some of the characteristics of the law that Hayek believes is necessary for government to minimize the total amount of coercion, or for there to be a maximization of the ability of people to act according to their own plan. And so this is what we talked about before, is that it should be general. You shouldn't know beforehand to whom the law is going to apply. We use the example of free parking, right? So you don't know beforehand to whom the laws apply. And if we sort of, it sort of makes it that the law is more like a part of the landscape, where you know, we're not making a river that's built, that's just put there to keep you from getting from point A to point B. It is part of the landscape, and then you guys can operate within that landscape. Second is that the law should apply equally to everyone. Again, this is something that we've talked about before, right? That's one of the foundations of liberalism, that it was equality under the law, right? Inequality of income, but equality under the law. And so why would we want that? It's because if there's a couple reasons. One is, if it's equality under the law, if you didn't have that, then I could go out, and if I didn't like you, then I could impose a law to coerce just you and not other people, or coerce a group of people. And so notice that if you have equality under the law, that there's less ability, right, to coerce particular people or groups of people, right? And if you have equality under the law, then if you have a law that people don't like, then if everybody's got to have it, then that law is probably not going to stay for very long, right? Because if there's a large amount of people that don't like the law, then what are you going to have? You're going to have an insurrection of some kind, or at least if you have a democracy, right? It's going to get it's going to get thrown out. So if you sort of think about that, also that the way he puts it is, bad laws, he says, will face the wrath of many. Okay. So the third thing that he talks about is that the law has to be avoidable. And what he means by that, you have to be able to comply. You have to be able to comply with the law. And why would you want to have that? Well, if you had a law against breathing, what I could do is, you guys can't avoid the, not complying with the law, and so what will happen is I could just throw you in jail, right? I could pick particular people, especially if the law doesn't apply equally to everybody. I could just pick you, or I could find something that, let's say I wanted to do left-handed, I didn't like left-handed people, I could make it, against the law for left-handed people to write with their left hand, okay? So then we could, throw you in jail for not writing with your right hand or whatever. So, but the point is that if you have to be able to comply with the law. If laws that some people can't comply with, you could use that ability to, or you could use that to coerce certain individuals rather than having to, if the law has to, if the law can be complied with, then it's more difficult for government to prosecute folks. All right. Then it should be known. And we've already talked about that. That is, we've talked about the fact that under the Michigan Constitution, the law has to remain in both houses for at least 5 days. A law can't take immediate effect in the state of Michigan without there being a supermajority of both houses. So why is that? Because we want people to know what the law is. If you don't know what the law is, then what we could do is we could coerce you. Now, think about what if you didn't know what the Internal Revenue Code looked like, right? You didn't know all the features of the Internal Revenue Code. For example, how many in here have ever made more than $600 in 1 year? Okay. You all know that you're supposed to file self-employed person tax, right? By April 15th, right? You've all? Oh, yeah. Yeah. I'll bet you there's some of you never heard of self-employed person tax, okay? And why would that be? If your employer did not withhold your Social Security taxes, then you have to file this. If your employer withheld your Social Security taxes, then you're good. But let's say that you mowed a bunch of lawns and you babysat and you had a bunch of things where you didn't, no one withheld. If you make more than $600, then you have to file self-employed person tax. Probably most people who babysat and mowed lawns don't have a clue that that's what the law is. But that means that if the government really wanted to go after you, then they could, right? So if you had laws that were so voluminous, in fact, we'll come back to this in a second, but if they have the laws that are thousands of pages long, it may be that lots of people may be in violation of the law, but they don't know it. and therefore they'll be, I could now go out and prosecute the people that I choose to prosecute and could coerce you. And the last thing is that the law ought to be predictable. Right? We can't make it so that you have built let's say you started a business and all of a sudden the government comes along and says, nah, can't operate your business, right? Can't operate that type of business. Let's say you had a restaurant and the government comes along and says, sorry, can't operate your restaurant. Well, think about if the law could be made so that it was unpredictable, then the government could wait to see what you're doing, and then it could do something to make it so that you can't fulfill what you wanted to do, right? They'd have ways of coercing you, and so again, why put these characteristics in there? Because you sort of think through it. If the law has these characteristics, that makes it harder for the government to go out and coerce folks, and you're trying to minimize that total amount of coercion. Now, let me read from Madison's Federalist 62. He says, "It will be of little avail to the people that the laws are made by men of their own choice, if the laws be so voluminous they cannot be read, or so incoherent that they cannot be understood, or if they be repealed or revised before they are promulgated, or undergo such incessant changes that no man who knows what the law is today can guess what it'll be like tomorrow." Right? It will little avail to the people that the laws are made by men of their own choice if these sorts of things that Hayek's been talking about are there, right? So Federalist 62 looks a lot like what Hayek's discussion of what a law is, a good law is. So to summarize, summarize this chapter 9, then what should the laws look like? They should be general. That is, I shouldn't know beforehand to whom this law is going to apply. They should apply equally to everyone. You should be able to comply with them, and they should be known and predictable. All right. So again, you should be able to discuss this with other people. If you are looking at what a law is being proposed by your legislator or by your congressman, then you'll want, you might say, hey, wait a minute, this law is going to go beyond the minimization of coercion. And so, it's again, why be able to understand these things well enough that you can explain them? It's so that you can go out there and sort of win the battle of ideas in some sense. All right. Then the last part of this chapter, he talks about the difference between what's legitimate and legal. And recall, this is what Bastiat talked about, right? When we read Bastiat, I mentioned this. He talks about there's a difference between what's legitimate and legal. Making something legal doesn't make it legitimate. Now, sometimes you'll hear discussions about laws against, that you want to have this law against the consumption of a certain good because if you legalize it, you make it legitimate, right? But that's not right, okay? Making something legal does not make it legitimate. Now again, what's the definition of legitimate, right? Well, that'll depend on your own ideas, but we may have a sort of a general feeling about what's legitimate. That is when we were reading the Mises, he talks about alcoholism and morphinism being pernicious evils, right? And that the rational individual should be against the consumption of those things. But he says you can't use the law to do that. It's not going to work out very well. And if you do, then you don't have a limit on what your government can do. And so Hayek's making a similar statement here. That is, in a free society where if a government is going to minimize coercion, right? Which is again what we're trying to do, right? That's what the government's role is. If the government's going to minimize coercion, there's going to be lots of actions that are legal, but not necessarily legitimate. And again, what he says is that conduct within the private sphere, conduct within the private sphere is not the proper subject for coercion, right? Conduct within the private sphere right, it's not an object for coercion. Yes?
What if conduct of the private sphere becomes an externality?
Well, if you have an externality, yes, okay. The question is, what about externalities? That is, what if, and again, we talk a good deal about this in my public finance course and in the public choice course. It's where your action affects me, and you don't bring that doesn't get taken into consideration through the market process. For example, we use the example of if this were 1970, right, and you went to buy gasoline, the gasoline had lead in it. And the reason gasoline had lead in it was because it gave you better gas mileage. But what was the problem? Well, the problem is, as you're driving along, you are spewing lead out into the atmosphere. And what is that doing? It's making so that the people that are, standing, by the road or whatever, they're breathing in this lead, and it's bad for them. It's causing them physical damage. But there's nothing in the price system that's going to pick that up. Pollution is sort of the standard example of an externality. And so what Hayek is talking about here is, are you doing something that basically that he says he's going to later on he's going to say that what you need for the social order is the market process, the spontaneous order of the market. Okay? If the market has a failure in the sense that the actual cost of what you're doing is greater than what you're paying in the price for doing that, then you have different mechanisms to try to deal with that. And in public finance, we talk at some length about that. We could have where you have to pay a tax which is exactly equal to the external cost that you're producing on somebody else, that sort of thing. There's lots of ways to deal with that. But Hayek's point here is that if it's conduct within the private sphere, that is, you're not causing harm to me, then that shouldn't be the object for governmental coercion. Yeah.
If there is, for instance, you talked about legalizing certain substances or whatever, and if there was some substance, I don't know much about this, but say there was a substance that caused psychosis and various extreme issues that could cause violence, even though that doesn't necessarily physically harm, it does have a potential to. So where's the line there for an externality?
Well, she's saying, what if you're consuming a substance that causes harm, okay, in your consumption of it, or causes the other people to be violent, right? Well, you'd have to have if you have a law against people being violent to you already, right? So we don't have to worry about that. But if it's something that you didn't know about, let's say OxyContin, right? I don't know if you've been following that, but there's a big issue with OxyContin. They had settled an $800 billion or whatever it was lawsuit. If what's happening is I don't tell you what's in this product, then that means you might not have bought the product had I not hidden this from you, or if I hadn't told you about what's the potential side effects of the thing. And so then that's the role of government to make sure that you're not committing fraud. And so there's looking at different ways so what's the big picture here? The big picture is that it is not the proper role of government to decide this is legitimate and this is not legitimate. Why would you make something illegal? You would make something illegal if what was happening, it was not minimizing the total amount of coercion, right? That's what I want to do. And so just as now notice again, like Mises was saying in liberalism, it's not saying that you shouldn't try to persuade people not to do these sorts of things. Whether it's you think that they shouldn't be, maybe you think that they shouldn't be driving cars that get less than 50 miles a gallon, right? You think that they shouldn't do that, right? It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be able to persuade them, oh, you should buy this kind of car, you should not, or you shouldn't drive as much, or you should ride mass transit, or there might be something that you think is going to make the world better. Then you can persuade them, but it's not the proper action of the government to go out and to be coercive on that issue. Again, if you take public finance, we spend a good deal of time on what she was talking about in terms of externalities. What happens when the market signal is not picking up all the costs or all the benefits? There may be things that we might want to subsidize people doing. Just as an example, if you fix up your house, right, it improves the value of the house next to you, okay? But there's not a way for you to capture the increase in the value of the house next to me. And so what happens? The added benefit from your fixing up your house is bigger than the added cost when you include the benefits to other people, but you're not going to do it, okay? Because the market isn't picking that up. Now, if you own both houses, then you'll include that, right? And so how do you deal with blight? I mean, that's just another issue that, blight is a problem where this externality issue comes in. You're letting your house run down. Just from the other side, if you're letting your house run down, it's imposing a cost on me, and that's not being picked up in the market process. But Hayek's general point here is that there's a limit on what government can do, right? That it's minimizing the total amount of coercion. And to the extent that it's not minimizing the total amount of coercion, then that's not what you want to do. If, in some sense, my action of doing something is coercing you, right? Then you could say, okay, we're gonna step in and decide where that boundary is. And we'll come back to that in just a moment. In fact, let's come back to it right now. This leads us into chapter 10. And again, chapter 10 is one of these chapters we're just going to basically summarize a little bit. But he says, law is the indivisible borderline that's fixed whereby within this line the being and activity of each individual can obtain a secure and free space. Right? What does that mean? It means that what is the law, right? It's a borderline. And within that border, you're free to act according to your own plan. Right? You have liberty. Right? So you're free to act So if I think about it this way, sort of use a Venn diagram in that suppose this is my action, this is my free action, and you have your free action here, right? This is your sphere, right? This is my sphere of free action and your sphere of free action. The law that is along here, right? The law determines what that limit is. And within that, because the law is that invisible borderline, wherein within this line, every individual has a secure and free sphere. Nobody can jump in there and do something. Now, what do you do about this area here, right? Where what you want to do interferes with what I want to do, where the law's got to set that boundary, right? So the law might set that boundary, you know, along here, or the law might set it here, or the law might set it there. So the law will determine, can you steal my stuff or not steal my stuff, right? And so what are you trying to do? You're trying to set the law so that you have the largest amount of free action out there. I want to maximize the amount of free action, minimize the amount of coercion. In this chapter, again, he says laws are abstract rules which are general and everyone must obey. Right? And why is he bringing this up? He's bringing this up because in a system of central planning, that can't work. Right? Laws are abstract rules which all must obey. They're not specific commands. And why is he bringing this up, right? He says that's what's necessary for a central planner. A central planner has to say, here's what you're going to produce. Here's where you're going to work. Here's what you're going to consume. This is the housing place that you're going to be in, right? That's not what the laws are in a free society, right? They're saying that, these are, when we think of the Ten Commandments, right, they're not commands in the sense that Hayek's talking about here. What are the Ten Commandments are about? They're establishing what these borderlines are, right? Thou shalt not kill. What is that doing? It's say, okay, here's the borderline. You want to kill me? I don't want you to kill me. We've established here's what the law is, right? You can't kill me. You can't steal, right? And again, we talked about the Ten Commandments as being general, right? We don't know beforehand who's going to be stealing and who's going to be killing or whatever. Even though we call them the Ten Commandments, they're really general rules that everybody has to obey. And so why talk about that is that if you're going to have socialism, it can't be that way. Socialism, the laws have to go beyond some, the boundary that we're going to give us the maximum sphere of free action. They're going to go beyond some abstract rule that everybody's got to obey. They're going to be specific commands. And a socialist system then can't have that. In fact, we talked about this before, any centrally planned state generally tends to be, any socially planned state is authoritarian, right? They all turn out to be authoritarian. He says, again, basically it's like a landscape. We were just talking about it a moment ago. They're like a landscape, right? The laws are like a landscape. And you can move about within that landscape. So you can think of it as rivers and mountains and valleys and stuff, and you're free to move about and they don't put an object in, someone doesn't just take a boulder and drop it right in front of you, okay? If that boulder's there, that boulder's there for everybody. And so, again, what we're trying to do is set up this system so you guys can all act according to your own plan. Because, again, we're trying to make the most efficient use of the fact that information is decentralized. And then he says, the chapter says, he says, the social order does not require more than the spontaneous order of the market. The social order does not require more than the spontaneous order of the market. Again, very similar to what Bastiat has suggested, right? Bastiat said that we need to know if what will happen when people interact, and if people are interacting with one another, of their own volition, it turns out to be a positive way of doing it, then we can start to think through where are the problems developing, and then where do we need government, right? And so that, again, when we were reading Bastiat, we said that that's the reason that we start out with the class the way we do, right? We learn how markets work, and then what's the role of government, right? Then we read Mises's liberalism, and then what Bastiat was talking about was say, okay, what are we trying to do when we're reading the law? He says we need to have a just government, and what is it there to do? A just government fulfills its purpose, which is to protect life, liberty, and property. Says, okay, why did we come up with that? If we know how markets work, we know that what do you need for markets to work, right? Markets require that you protect life, liberty, and property. And so we get a similar story here that he says the social order doesn't require more than the spontaneous order of the market, right? Which is what, that's very consistent with what Bastiat was talking about and what Mises was talking about. I don't need more than the market. And of course, the market is spontaneous and that there's nobody in charge of the whole thing, but it's orderly. 9 million people woke up in New York City today, and there was exactly the right amount of Starbucks coffee and peanuts and everything else, even though we got a major pandemic going on, right? And so, it is an order. The market is an orderly system, but it's spontaneous in the sense that nobody's in charge of the thing. And that's what Hayek is basically saying, that we don't need more than this spontaneous order of the market to have a social order. Okay, chapter 11 then it's an interesting chapter. It's about the ordinance of law. There's nothing that we would require an essay about. Just go ahead and be able to recognize a multiple choice or true-false question that would be out of it, right? So you don't have to do more than make sure that you've read through it, and when you see something that came from there on the exam, again, you can look at some of the old exams and see the type of, sometimes they'll put a multiple choice or true-false question from chapter 11 in there, but just make sure that you've read through it. Don't spend a lot of time on it. But chapter 12 is an important chapter. Chapter 12 is about the written constitution, right? That's what chapter 12 is about. And what does he start out with? He's saying in 1767, the British Parliament came along and said, you know what? Parliament can write any law that it wants, pretty much. That's what this 1767 this British Parliament Declaration, right? That is basically that your Parliament is unbound, right? And so what happened was, what Hayek says is that some of the colonial leaders, like Sam Adams and Patrick Henry and the like, they came along and they said, Parliament doesn't really have that power. But then when they looked at it, they saw that the British Constitution was not a true limiting document. When the colonial leaders got there and they said, you know what, it doesn't have much substance to it. And so what they decided was they needed a foundation document. Okay, so if we looked at Sam Adams and Patrick Henry, etc., what did they decide? That we need a foundation document that's going to set forth what these limitations are going to be. That is, we want to have a written constitution that limits the power of the legislative and executive bodies. Okay, so that we need a way to limit what our government is. We need to have some foundation document that does that. Well, one of the main things that they were concerned with is that the government should have no arbitrary power. Oops. The government should have no arbitrary power. And that is the only power that it's going to have is the powers that are explicitly granted to it. Right? Again, if you've ever read the Constitution, which I think you have to take a class in that, right? So you know, what does your Constitution say, right? If you think of, look, the Constitution says that the federal government only has those powers that are explicitly granted to it, right? So there's no arbitrary power, right? That it's only powers that are explicitly granted. And if what is this document that is going to provide for this is what? This is the Constitution, right? So the Constitution is what's going to set forth that your government doesn't have arbitrary power, but only those powers granted to it by the people. And Hayek argues that this was the colonies are the first time that they put it on a written document a higher order of law. Right? So think about it. That is, what's unique about the United States Constitution is that it says it's the first time you put in a document a higher order of law. That is, you'd had a concept of a higher order of law out there for centuries. That is, and this is as a governing principle, right? If we put it this way, as a governing that is how you're going to set your government up, right? We're going to set our government up so that there's a higher order of law. There's the Constitution, and then there's legislative law. But legislative law has to comply with this higher order of law. So we've had a concept of a higher order of law that's been around for a long time. If you go back and you can read about divine law, right? You can't have if this were the 13th century, we would argue that the king couldn't proclaim things which went against divine law. All right? Or we've had discussions about natural law. That you wouldn't have legislation that went against natural law. But even if you went on Wikipedia, it would be very hard to find divine law written out, right? Article 1, Section 3, subparagraph 2, divine law says this, right? You can't find that, right? So what Hayek is arguing is that we've had a concept of a higher order of law, but we haven't really had a concept of a higher order of law that limits what the law of your government is, that's limiting what your government can do. And that the Constitution was the first time, the United States Constitution was the first time that we actually wrote down, here's a written document, here's what is the order of law. And we're going to have the higher order of law is going to be the written document, it's going to be this Constitution. And so, what does that mean? It means that the legislators are bound by this higher order of law when making ordinary law, right? Statutes. As is the executive branch, right? If you look at what the powers of the executive branch are, you have that both in the United States Constitution and you have it in the Michigan Constitution. The idea then is that the legislators are bound by this higher order of law. And what are these? These are general principles. Remember, we keep saying that Hayek keeps saying that the temporary majority should be bound by some general principles, right? So what does this mean? Is they're going to be bound by some general principles when enacting law, enacting ordinary law. And so the legislative body, when it's going to make it's going to deal with a particular case. Remember that Hayek says that democracy is particularly liable to when it may, because it does piecemeal legislation, if not bound by some general principle, that it's going to end up with consequences that people might not have wanted at the beginning, right? We gave you the example of the franchise laws, etc. Okay? So what he's saying here is just what do we put down? The Constitution is that document that makes it so that there's a general principle that's binding what the temporary majority can do. One of the things that means is that the legislature should not be able to amend the Constitution. If you had a constitution that the legislator could amend, then it wouldn't be binding, right? The legislator should not be able to amend the Constitution. So let's say you're Afghanistan. And you are going to say, you know what, we've really had some difficulties over the last, decades. How about we set up a government, and what we'll do is we'll sort of do what, we've read Hayek, and we think that the role of government is to, minimize the total amount of coercion. What should we do? Well, we will have this written document that limits what the temporary majority could do. But when you wrote your Constitution out, you wouldn't make it so that the legislature could amend the Constitution. Because if that happened, how could it be binding? How could it be binding on the legislature? Right? If there was something that was constraining what the legislature could do, what could they do? They could simply amend the Constitution to make it so that it worked. Then you might have a supermajority rule or something like that. But the bottom line is it can't really operate as a mechanism to bind the temporary majority if the legislature can amend it. That is, if the he says that what's going to happen is that the temporary majority is going to be bound by some general principles that have been agreed to over a long period of time, right? That is, this temporary majority the temporary majority is going to be bound by some general principles that have been agreed to. By a majority over a period of time. So what does that mean when we're going to do the when we enact a statute? What binds what that statute could look like? What binds what that statute could look like is these general principles that we've agreed on, right? And notice that at some point, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but at some point, if we have changed what our general principles are, then what would happen? Then you would amend the Constitution, right? And there's mechanisms to do that, and we'll talk more about that later, but there's mechanisms to do that. But the point here is that the current majority is going to be bound by these general principles that we've agreed on, and it says that we're better off with these limits than solving a particular problem, right? So we're better off staying within the limits than solving a particular problem. That is, you can't say, oh, wow, this problem was so, let's say it's the Great Depression, or let's say it's the coronavirus out there, right? There's a pandemic out there. Should we pass a law that violates the Constitution in order to solve this problem, right? And what Hayek would argue is, no, what do you need to do? You need to amend the Constitution to say, okay, we weren't thinking, we hadn't thought about this. We now have this, we've now agreed that if there's a state of emergency, then the legislature should be able to do this, that, or the executive branch should be able to do this, that, or the other thing, right? So if we've changed what our general principles are, then we can, then we would amend the Constitution. But his point here is that you're better off limiting your government through these general principles than ad hoc solving particular problems. Because once you do that, then you're no longer going to be limiting what your legislature can do. All right, so for Friday and Monday, we will go through and we will finish chapter 12. All right, and that's what's going to be on the exam. And then again, the review session. Actually, I forgot. How many would like to do the review session at 6 o'clock? This is on that Thursday. How many would like to do it at 7 o'clock? Okay, so your section will be at 7 o'clock on the Thursday before the exam. Is that November, what is that, the 5th? Is that November 5th, all right? All right.